Why is my mother's signature on a paper she never saw? Margaret Whittaker whispered as rainwater dripped from the edge of the document onto her trembling hands. The paper lay inside a soaked envelope at her feet, half buried in the wet grass of the front yard she had spent nearly 4 decades tending. Behind her, a moving truck idled in the driveway. In front of her, strangers carried furniture through the front door of the only home she had ever truly called hers. And 20 miles away, an abandoned church everyone considered worthless sat waiting with a secret hidden beneath its altar. 3 days earlier, Margaret's life had still looked ordinary. Not perfect, not easy, but ordinary. At 61, she lived alone in the white clapboard house her late husband had built with his own hands 37 years earlier. The porch sagged slightly on the left side. The mailbox leaned crooked after a winter storm. The kitchen faucet dripped every few hours despite 3 repair attempts. But every scratch in the hardwood floor carried a memory. Every room held a piece of her life. The house smelled faintly of lemon polish and old books. Smelled like home. That Tuesday morning began with overdue bills spread across the dining room table. An electric bill. Property tax notice. A prescription refill reminder folded neatly beside a pair of reading glasses. Margaret sat in silence with a mug of coffee that had gone cold. After helping her children through divorces, layoffs, medical emergencies, and credit card debt over the years, her savings account had fallen to just under $8,000. Not enough to feel secure. Too much to qualify for help. It was a familiar place for many people her age. Still, she never complained. When the phone rang, she expected one of her children. Instead, it was a real estate office asking when she planned to vacate the property. Margaret thought they had called the wrong number. By noon, she learned they had not. The woman on the phone remained polite, almost painfully polite, professional, efficient, the kind of voice that delivered disasters every day. According to county records, ownership had already transferred. The closing had been completed 48 hours earlier. Margaret laughed at first. Then she stopped laughing. By evening, she was standing in her own front yard while rain rolled across the neighborhood in gray sheets. 3 cardboard boxes sat beside her old 2011 Ford Fusion. One contained family photographs. One held clothes and medications. The third carried the few items she had inherited from her father years ago, including an old silver pocket watch and a ring of rusted keys attached to a faded leather tag. The tag read, St. Matthew Church. Across the lawn, her son Daniel stood beneath an umbrella speaking quietly with an attorney. He wouldn't meet her eyes for more than a second at a time. His wife remained inside the house. The attorney approached carrying a folder. His suit stayed perfectly dry beneath a black umbrella. Mrs. Whittaker, he said gently, I know this is difficult, but the documents appear to be legally executed. Peer. Margaret noticed that word immediately. She accepted the folder without speaking. Her fingers felt numb from the cold. The rain had begun washing ink from the top page. Yet one thing remained painfully clear. The signature at the bottom looked exactly like hers. As she stared at it, the pocket watch slipped from her coat pocket and struck the driveway. The cover sprang open. Inside, beneath a photograph of her father she had seen 1,000 times before, were 6 words she had somehow never noticed. If you lose home, come to mine. Margaret pressed her fingers against the wet envelope, feeling the rough texture of the paper and the faint indentation of her own signature she had never written. She stepped back from the soggy lawn and counted the contents of her wallet. $211. Enough for gas, enough for a motel for a night or two, but nothing more. The Fusion's engine groaned when she turned the key, coughing before settling into a reluctant idle. Her eyes scanned the driveway, where movers stacked boxes of her belongings and office supplies once familiar, now foreign and indifferent, into the back of the truck. One of the movers, a young man with a baseball cap, laughed softly at the faded blue curtains she had made decades ago and muttered, "Looks like junk." She clenched her jaw, nodded politely, and retrieved a worn leather strap holding her photo albums and a small jewelry box. In the glove compartment, she found the deed to the church she hadn't thought of in years, the corners curling and ink smudged by time. The attorney's voice crackled from her phone, clinical and impersonal. "All legal, Mrs. Whitaker. I need you to sign here," as he held a scanned signature line that seemed to mock her. Margaret took the pen, exhaled, and signed with a deliberate calm that contrasted the storm outside. A few blocks away, her son drove slowly past, speaking into his headset, his expression careful, unreadable. Margaret counted her possessions again. The albums, the jewelry box, her father's pocket watch, a set of rusty keys labeled St. Matthew Church, a prescription bottle not yet filled, and the $211. Nothing else. The mailbox leaned from the last storm, the porch light flickered, and a single rain-drenched court order, notice of the home sale, slid out from beneath the door, the stamp still wet. She picked it up, examined the names and signatures, and noticed something odd. The parcel number for the church on the deed was handwritten in pencil, unlike the pre-printed lines of the rest of the document. A subtle alteration, almost invisible, but enough to make her pause. The movers had finished and left. The front yard was empty save for her 3 cardboard boxes and the gray drizzle. Margaret wrapped the albums in her arms, placed the jewelry box gently on top, and slung the leather strap over her shoulder. She stared at the street and then at the church on the hill beyond the neighborhood. Abandoned, weathered, its steeple cracked and paint flaking like old parchment. No one else had looked twice at it in years, but now, holding the keys loosely in her palm, she wondered if this relic of her father's past, once dismissed as junk, might be her only chance. Her breath caught as a single raindrop slid down the back of her neck, and she realized with a shiver that the building she had long ignored could be more than a shelter. It could be the first step back into a life she was determined to reclaim. Her fingers tightened around the rusted church keys as she sat behind the wheel of the Fusion, watching the rain crawl across the windshield in crooked silver lines. The church stood nearly 40 miles away, on the far edge of Ashford County, beyond the soybean fields and forgotten roads she hadn't driven in more than 15 years. She could have tried a motel. She could have spent part of the $211 on a room with clean sheets and a working heater. But motels charged by the night. The church, for better or worse, belonged to her. Margaret started the engine and pulled onto the highway. The fuel gauge hovered just above a quarter tank. Every mile felt expensive. Every mile also felt like she was driving farther away from the humiliation of standing in her own yard while strangers carried away her life. Twilight settled over the county as she passed weathered barns, abandoned grain silos, and gas stations that had long ago stopped selling gas. The farther she drove, the quieter the world became. 23 miles from town, she stopped at a convenience store to buy a cup of coffee and use the restroom. The cashier, a woman about her daughter's age, glanced at the church deed sticking out of Margaret's folder. "St. Matthew's?" she asked. "That old place is still standing?" Margaret nodded. "Barely." The cashier gave a short laugh. "Nobody wants that property. Last appraisal said it wasn't worth fixing. My uncle called it a money pit with a steeple." She handed back the coffee without another word. Margaret thanked her anyway. 40 minutes later, she turned onto County Road 18. The pavement narrowed. Trees crowded closer to the road. The church finally appeared through the darkness, its silhouette rising above the weeds like the skeleton of something forgotten. The white paint had faded to gray. Several stained glass windows were boarded over. The bell tower leaned slightly to one side. A chain-link fence sagged around the perimeter. Margaret parked beside the gravel lot and stepped out into the cold evening air. The building looked smaller than she remembered. Sadder too. Her father had left it to her 12 years earlier when he died. At the time, her children had encouraged her to sell it immediately. Daniel had called it a tax burden. Her daughter Emily had called it an old dump. The estate attorney had been even more direct. "Mrs. Whitaker, the church has virtually no market value. Frankly, keeping it may cost more than it's worth." So Margaret had done what everyone expected. She locked the door after the funeral and never came back. Until now. The old deed crackled softly in her hands as she climbed the front steps. A county tax notice remained wedged beneath the doorframe, yellowed by years of weather. Unpaid assessments. Deferred maintenance warnings. inspection notices. Nobody had cared enough to remove them. The key resisted when she pushed it into the lock. For a moment she thought it wouldn't fit. Then the mechanism groaned and turned. Before opening the door, Margaret looked down at the deed one more time. That strange handwritten parcel number caught her eye again. Every other line had been typed. Only that number had been added later in dark pencil. She frowned. Why would anyone alter a parcel reference on an old church deed? A pickup truck rolled slowly past on the road behind her. The driver turned his head toward the church, lingered for a second too long, then continued into the darkness. Margaret watched the taillights disappear. Then she looked back at the weathered key still resting in her hand. She had no way of knowing that the building everyone called worthless had been waiting for that key to return for many years. Margaret pushed the door open the rest of the way, and the church answered with a long groan from old hinges that hadn't moved in years. The sound echoed through the sanctuary before dissolving into silence. Cold air drifted out to meet her. It smelled of damp wood, dust, old paper, and the faint scent of candle wax trapped in the walls long after the last service had ended. She stepped inside and pulled the door shut behind her. For a moment, she simply stood there. Her eyes adjusted slowly to the darkness. Moonlight filtered through stained glass windows, painting faded patches of blue, red, and gold across the floorboards. Dust floated through the colored beams like tiny ghosts. The church felt abandoned, but not dead. Rows of wooden pews stretched toward the altar. Several sat crooked where the floor beneath them had settled over time. A section of the ceiling near the rear corner sagged noticeably. Water stains spread across plaster walls like old maps. Somewhere above her, rain tapped softly against the roof. Margaret set her cardboard boxes beside the front pew and rolled her sore shoulders. Every possession she still owned now sat inside those 3 containers. 37 years in one house reduced to a few cubic feet of cardboard. She removed her coat and folded it carefully across a pew. Then she opened the first box. Family photographs, a blanket, prescription medicine, 2 cans of tomato soup, a flashlight. She placed the soup beside the altar and checked the expiration dates. Still good. Barely. The church had no running water that she could see, and she wasn't even sure the electricity still worked. She walked along the wall searching for a breaker panel. Her flashlight beam swept across old hymn boards, faded notices, and a calendar hanging beside a doorway. The calendar displayed October 2011. 15 years old. Nobody had touched it since. She found a light switch and flipped it. Nothing. Another switch. Nothing again. The building remained silent except for the rain and the occasional creak of settling wood. Margaret wasn't surprised. She had expected worse. Years ago, her father had taught her that old buildings always told the truth if you paid attention long enough. She moved deeper into the church. Behind the altar sat a small office. The door stuck halfway before finally giving way. Inside, dust coated everything. A desk.
A filing cabinet.
A bookshelf leaning slightly against the wall. On the desk sat a ceramic coffee mug with a cracked handle. Beside it rested a pair of reading glasses. Margaret stopped breathing for a second. They looked exactly like her father's. The lenses were clouded with dust, but they remained exactly where he had left them, as though he had simply stepped outside and never returned. Her fingers brushed the edge of the desk. Beneath the dust, she found a photograph lying face down. She turned it over carefully. The picture showed her father standing beside 3 people she didn't recognize. Behind them stretched an open field instead of the tree line that now surrounded the church. Someone had written a note on the back in faded pencil. "Keep it hidden until she needs it." Margaret frowned. She read the sentence twice, then 3 times. She had no idea what it meant. The flashlight beam drifted across the office wall. Something immediately felt wrong. One section of paneling looked newer than the rest. The wood grain didn't match. The paint color was slightly different, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. Margaret stepped closer and pressed her palm against the wall. Solid. Then she knocked lightly with her knuckles. Most of the wall answered with a dull thud, but one section responded with a hollow sound from somewhere behind it. Margaret kept her hand against the wall for several seconds, listening to the hollow space behind it. Then she stepped back. A hidden cavity was possible in a building this old. Electrical access, storage, old plumbing. Her father had repaired parts of this church for decades. There could be a perfectly ordinary explanation. Right now, she needed a roof that leaked less than the sky outside. The mystery could wait. Survival could not. By morning, the church felt even colder. She had spent the night wrapped in a blanket on the front pew, waking every few hours to the sound of rain striking the stained glass windows. Her neck ached. Her knees protested when she stood. The bottle of blood pressure medication on the altar had only 6 pills left. Her phone showed 11% battery. No missed calls. No messages. Margaret slipped the phone back into her coat pocket and got to work. She started with the broken glass near the entrance. Using an old push broom she found in a maintenance closet, she swept shards into a rusted dustpan. Every movement sent tiny aches through her shoulders. Dust coated her jeans and settled into the creases of her hands. She worked steadily anyway. For most of her life she had taken care of things. Her husband when cancer left him too weak to stand. Her children when they were sick. Her mother through the final year of dementia. Labor felt more familiar than grief. Around noon she found a ladder in the storage room behind the sanctuary. One leg was bent slightly, but it still held her weight. She carried a faded blue tarp from the church shed and climbed onto the roof. The wind cut through her jacket. Twice she nearly lost her balance. By the time she secured the tarp over the largest leak, her fingers were numb and her shoes were soaked through. Looking down from the roofline, she could see the entire property. The church, the overgrown cemetery, the field behind the building. Strange. The field appeared larger than she remembered. Much larger. She filed the thought away and climbed down. That afternoon she tackled the office. She wiped dust from the desk where her father's glasses still rested. She cleaned shelves, sorted old papers, filled 2 trash bags with moldy magazines and ruined church bulletins. The quiet became almost comforting. The soft scrape of the broom, the whisper of pages turning, rain tapping the roof. Then something unexpected happened. While pulling open the bottom drawer of the desk, she found it stuck halfway. At first she assumed swollen wood was the cause. The church was full of warped furniture. She tugged harder. The drawer moved another inch and stopped again. Something blocked it from inside. Margaret crouched lower and aimed her flashlight into the gap. A thin metal object glinted in the darkness. She reached in carefully and worked it loose. A key. Small. Brass. Unlike the rusted church keys her father had left behind. This one looked newer, cleaner, as though it belonged somewhere specific. She turned it over in her palm. A tiny stamped number appeared near the base. 214. Margaret frowned. Perhaps it belonged to an old filing cabinet. A locker. A mailbox. Something ordinary. Yet when she returned to the desk drawer, she noticed another detail. The drawer wasn't merely stuck. Someone had installed a wooden block inside to prevent it from opening completely. Not decades ago. Relatively recently. The screws holding the block in place were bright compared to everything else in the room. Newer than the surrounding wood. Newer than the dust. Margaret sat back slowly. The office fell silent except for the rain. Then her flashlight beam caught something else beneath the desk. A faint scrape mark stretched across the floorboards toward the newer section of wall she had discovered the night before, as if heavy furniture had been moved away from that spot more than once. Margaret heard the crunch of gravel and a familiar voice calling her name before she even saw him. Walter, the retired hardware store owner from town, emerged from behind the church with a canvas grocery bag in one hand and a worn ladder slung over his shoulder. "Thought you might need a few things," he said, setting the bag down on the damp floor. Inside were cans of soup, a flashlight, and a roll of duct tape. He glanced at the brass key she had found the day before. "That's the one your father always kept for the office drawer. Never thought anyone would need it again," he said, voice low, almost hesitant. Margaret held it up. "You mean this key? I found it stuck in a drawer, and the screws are newer." Someone tried to lock it from the inside. Walter's eyes flickered to the floor, then back to her. Yeah, unusual timing, he murmured. He reached for a ledger on the desk, flipping through pages yellowed with age. Margaret noticed a name that matched a small shop she had passed on the drive over. Her father had purchased nails, hinges, and paint from Walter decades ago, always on account, never cash. Margaret asked about it. He helped a lot of people here, quietly, paid debts, kept the school kids safe, made sure families didn't lose roofs over their heads. His voice caught slightly at the last words. Margaret leaned closer, observing the scuff marks on the ledger. A date matched the note she had seen on the back of the old photograph under the desk. Summer, the year after a big fire in town. She asked, "Was that during the fire?" Walter paused, swallowing. "Some things are better left in memories," he said. He gestured to the ceiling, where the patched boards and the water stains told a story of constant repairs, of care, of someone who had refused to let the building crumble. Margaret nodded, absorbing the weight of what he was saying. Her hands hovered over the ledger, over the photograph, over the brass key, connecting the pieces. Walter picked up the grocery bag and set it carefully next to the desk. "Your father left more than wood and nails here," he said softly. "He left the soul of this place in the right hands." He gave her a long look, then pointed to the ladder. "If you need to reach the attic or check the breaker, it's all yours." His gaze lingered on the corner where the wall panel had sounded hollow the night before, and Margaret realized, with a shiver, that the church was more than a shelter. It was alive with history, and her father's quiet guardianship had kept it waiting for her. Margaret followed Walter's gaze toward the section of wall one more time after he left. The old hardware store owner's words lingered in the sanctuary long after the sound of his pickup disappeared down the road. He left the ladder behind, along with something else she couldn't quite name. Not information. Not exactly. Permission, perhaps. Permission to stop treating the strange details as coincidences. The church settled around her in the late afternoon quiet. Wind whispered beneath the front door. Somewhere in the rafters, an old beam creaked softly. Margaret carried the photograph from the office back into the sanctuary and placed it on the front pew beneath a shaft of colored light from the stained glass windows. Then she studied it carefully. For the first time, she stopped looking at the people and started looking at the building behind them. The church in the photograph wasn't exactly the same church standing around her now. The front entrance matched. The bell tower matched. But the wall behind the altar looked different. She narrowed her eyes. In the photograph, a narrow window appeared where the newer paneling now stood. Margaret stood immediately. She carried the picture to the office and compared it against the actual wall. The difference was unmistakable. At some point, someone had removed a window and covered the opening entirely. "Why?" she whispered to the empty room. Old churches changed over time. Repairs happened. Renovations happened. That explanation made sense. At least at first. Then she noticed the scrape marks again. The long grooves in the floorboards beneath the desk. They didn't lead randomly across the room. They pointed directly toward the altered section of wall. Margaret crouched and ran her fingers through one of the grooves. The marks were deep, repeated. Something heavy had been moved back and forth across this floor many times. She grabbed the flashlight and examined the baseboard. The paint near the paneling was slightly newer than the surrounding wall. Not recent, but decades newer than everything else nearby. Her father's office suddenly felt less like an abandoned workspace and more like a room that had been deliberately rearranged. Outside, tires crackled over gravel. Margaret froze. A vehicle had stopped near the church entrance. She crossed to the front window and carefully pulled aside a curtain. A dark SUV sat near the road. Not parked in the lot. Not approaching. Just sitting there. After less than a minute, it slowly drove away. Margaret watched until it disappeared behind the trees. Maybe someone was curious. Maybe not. But unease settled into her stomach anyway. Back in the office, she picked up the brass key again. Number 214. She checked every visible lock in the room. Desk drawers. Filing cabinets. Storage closets. Nothing fit. The key belonged somewhere else. Somewhere hidden. Evening arrived. Rain returned. Soft at first. Then harder against the roof. Margaret heated a can of soup on her small camping stove and sat alone at the desk listening to the weather. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Just rain. Wind. The occasional rattle of loose glass. Then an old screw rolled across the floor. She looked up. The screw had fallen from beneath the newer section of wall. Margaret stared. The vibration from the storm should not have loosened a screw buried behind paneling. Unless the panel itself wasn't fully secured. Her pulse quickened. She carried the screwdriver from her father's toolbox into the office and examined the wall more closely. Near the bottom corner, hidden beneath years of dust and paint, she found a narrow seam barely wider than a fingernail. Someone had worked very hard to conceal it. But not perfectly. Margaret slid the tip of the screwdriver into the gap and felt it sink farther than solid wall should allow. Behind the panel there was empty space. Margaret pressed the flathead screwdriver deeper into the narrow seam of the wall, carefully prying the panel loose. It shifted just enough to reveal a small cavity, dust spilling out like the first layer of forgotten time. Inside, she saw a brass-edged envelope, the paper yellowed and soft at the corners, tied with a frayed leather cord. She gingerly lifted it free, feeling the weight of decades. The leather strap crumbled slightly under her fingers, releasing a faint scent of old ink and candle smoke. Setting her flashlight beside the panel, Margaret sat on the floorboards, cross-legged, and untied the cord. Inside the envelope were several folded sheets of paper, stacked unevenly, some edges curling from moisture. The handwriting was unmistakably her father's. Precise but slightly shaky in places, the ink faded to brown. She unfolded the top page. It was a deed, stamped by Ashford County, with a parcel number matching the tiny handwritten number she had noticed earlier on the church deed. Her heart quickened. A second sheet listed adjacent plots of land, all purchased under his name decades ago, with dates she knew predated her birth. Another page contained a handwritten note. Keep for Margaret. When the time comes, it will be yours to understand. She ran her finger across the signature, Thomas Whitaker, and froze. The meticulous script matched every signature she had ever seen from her father. Yet one line was overwritten, altered with a faint pencil correction. She flipped to the next sheet. A ledger entry with her father's initials, the same date as the ledger page Walter had pointed out, and a sum repeated thrice, $214, curiously echoing the key she had found. Margaret leaned back against the wall, pressed the envelope to her chest, and took a slow breath. The faint hum of the rain outside filled the silence. She photographed each page with her phone, careful to preserve the fragile edges, and tucked the bundle into her coat. Her mind raced. Were some signatures corrected? Why were the plots purchased before she existed? Why did the key and the sum repeat across documents? The building groaned around her, but for a moment, she allowed herself to feel the gravity of holding her father's secrets in her hands. The final line on the last sheet made her catch her breath. Margaret Whitaker, Route 11, St. Matthew Parish. Margaret Whitaker, Route 11, St. Matthew Parish. The words seemed to linger in the dim office long after she lowered the paper. Her father had written her name there decades ago. Not recently, not as part of a will, not after some diagnosis or final regret. Long before any of this happened. Long before her children sold her house. Long before she found herself sleeping on a church pew with 6 blood pressure pills left and $200 to her name. Margaret folded the document carefully and slid it back into the envelope. Then she noticed something else tucked beneath the ledger sheets. A smaller bundle of papers bound together with a faded rubber band that crumbled the moment she touched it. Receipts. Dozens of them. Pharmacy receipts. Grocery receipts. Utility bills. Not for the church. For people. The first receipt showed a prescription paid in full for a woman Margaret vaguely remembered from childhood. Another covered heating oil for a widower who had lost his wife. Another paid a family's overdue electric bill 2 weeks before service would have been disconnected. The amounts weren't large.
$40.
$78. $123. Small X. Repeated hundreds of times. Margaret stared at the stack. Her father had never spoken about charity. He wasn't that kind of man. He fixed things. Changed spark plugs. Repaired roofs. Quiet men rarely advertised kindness. She found another envelope. This one contained letters. None had been mailed. The first began with a shaky greeting addressed to a woman named Carol Jenkins. Halfway through, Thomas Whitaker apologized for refusing payment after helping save her farm from foreclosure. Another letter thanked a local doctor for treating 3 uninsured children and included a cashier's check. Margaret recognized several names from town. Some still lived there. Others had passed away years ago. The church office suddenly felt smaller. Not because of what was hidden in the walls, but because of what had been hidden in plain sight. Late that afternoon, she drove into town and stopped at Walter's hardware store. The bell above the door jingled softly as she entered. Walter looked up from behind the counter. One glance at the envelope in her hands and something in his expression changed. Not surprise, recognition. Margaret placed a receipt on the counter. "Who was Carol Jenkins?" she asked. Walter adjusted his glasses. For several seconds he didn't answer. Then he sat down slowly on a stool. "Carol would have lost everything back in '94, he said quietly. "Bank was ready to take the farm. Your father paid 6 months of her mortgage and never told a soul." Margaret pulled out another receipt. Then another. "And these?" Walter smiled sadly. "Same story, different people." The old hardware store fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Margaret looked around. She suddenly noticed things she had overlooked before. A photograph near the register. Her father standing beside Walter 30 years younger. A church picnic. Children running through sprinklers. Families gathered around folding tables. Community. "Why didn't he tell me any of this?" she asked. Walter's smile faded. His eyes dropped toward the counter. "Because talking about it would have ruined the reason he did it." Margaret accepted that answer. At least partly. But another document caught her attention before she left. Folded between 2 receipts was a land survey. Unlike the others, someone had circled a name in red ink. Hawthorne Development Group. Walter saw it and immediately looked away. The movement was small. Too small for most people to notice. Margaret did. "Walter," she said softly. "Who are they?" He remained silent for several seconds. Then he answered with only 4 words. "People your father distrusted." That night, back in the church office, Margaret sat beneath a single battery lantern and read until her eyes burned. Receipts became letters. Letters became church records. Church records became names. Again and again she found the same pattern. Her father helping people, protecting people, paying costs nobody knew existed. And woven through the documents like a shadow was that same company name appearing in surveys, correspondence, and notes written in the margins. Hawthorne. Whatever secret her father had hidden, it wasn't about money alone. It was about something he had spent years protecting. As midnight approached, Margaret unfolded one final page from the bottom of the stack. Across the top, in her father's handwriting, were 7 words that made her chest tighten. "If you're reading this, you're finally ready. If you're reading this, you're finally ready." Margaret read the sentence 3 more times beneath the glow of the battery lantern. Outside, rain tapped steadily against the stained glass windows. The church felt smaller now, as if the walls themselves were leaning closer. Her father's words no longer sounded sentimental. They sounded deliberate. The next morning, she loaded the envelope, the deeds, the land survey, and the ledger copies into a worn canvas tote and drove to the Ashford County Records office. The building sat beside the courthouse, a red brick structure that smelled faintly of paper, floor polish, and old filing cabinets. Margaret spent nearly 2 hours comparing parcel maps. First, nothing made sense. The church itself occupied less than 2 acres, hardly valuable, but the parcel number handwritten on her father's deed connected to another parcel. Then another. Then another. A chain of adjacent properties stretching behind the church and across several hundred acres of land. Margaret stared at the map spread across the table. Every parcel had been acquired over decades through separate purchases. Different years, different sellers. Yet every transfer ultimately pointed back to trusts connected to Thomas Whitaker. The clerk helping her adjust a stack of records and frowned. "That's strange," she murmured. "These parcels were consolidated years ago." "Consolidated into what?" Margaret asked. The woman typed for a moment. Her expression changed. "I've never seen this before." She rotated the monitor. A protected land easement covered most of the acreage. Conservation rights, development restrictions, community use provisions. The land could not be commercially developed without overturning multiple legal agreements. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. Hawthorne Development Group suddenly made more sense. They hadn't wanted the church. They wanted the land behind it. She spent the rest of the afternoon making copies and taking photographs. Then she called an attorney recommended by Walter, a semi-retired property lawyer named Rebecca Sloan. Rebecca agreed to meet her that evening. They spread the documents across a folding table inside the church office. Rebecca studied them carefully for nearly an hour before speaking. "Margaret, do you understand what your father did?" Margaret shook her head. "Not completely." Rebecca tapped the land survey. "Your father spent 30 years quietly assembling a protected corridor of land around this community." She pointed to another document. "If these trusts are valid, and they appear to be, then the church isn't the valuable asset." Her finger moved across the map. "Control of these easements is." Margaret stared at the acreage highlighted in faded ink. Hundreds of acres, forest, creek access, agricultural land, community preservation rights, things worth far more than money, things that could protect the town itself. Rebecca pulled another sheet from the envelope. A trust document Margaret hadn't noticed before. Near the bottom sat a clause naming a successor trustee. Margaret's breath caught when she saw her own name. "My father made me the trustee?" Rebecca nodded slowly. "It appears so." For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then headlights swept across the stained glass windows. Both turned toward the parking lot. A black SUV had pulled up outside. The same model Margaret had seen near the church days earlier. A man stepped out wearing an expensive raincoat. He carried a leather portfolio and the kind of polite smile that rarely reached the eyes. Rebecca watched through the window. "Do you know him?" Margaret shook her head. A knock echoed through the church. 3 calm, measured taps. The man introduced himself as Michael Hawthorne. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said pleasantly when she opened the door only a few inches. "I represent several parties interested in helping you with this property. Frankly, that building is unsafe. The paperwork is complicated. We'd be happy to purchase everything and relieve you of the burden." Margaret said nothing. Hawthorne's smile remained perfectly professional. "You don't fully understand what you're holding," he added. Then his eyes drifted toward the documents on the table behind her. For the first time, Margaret realized something chilling. He wasn't guessing. He already knew exactly what her father had left behind. Then Rebecca opened the trust document again and found a county valuation attachment folded inside. At the bottom, beneath the legal description of the easements, was an estimated protected land value that exceeded $12 million. More than $12 million. Margaret stared at the number while rain slid down the stained glass windows behind her. For years, people had called St. Matthew's a burden, a dump, a forgotten church rotting on the edge of town. Now a man in a tailored raincoat stood at her door offering to help her carry the burden. Michael Hawthorne's smile never changed, but something in his eyes sharpened when Margaret stepped slightly in front of the table containing the documents. He noticed the movement. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said calmly, "I think it would be wise to have a conversation before misunderstandings create unnecessary complications." Rebecca folded the valuation sheet and slipped it into a folder. "This isn't a good time." Hawthorne nodded politely. "Of course. I'll leave my card." He placed a business card on the nearest pew. "Just understand that properties like this often attract legal issues, easements, trust disputes, safety compliance reviews. These old structures can become liabilities very quickly. Then he left. The sound of his SUV faded into the darkness. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Finally, Rebecca exhaled. That wasn't a purchase offer. What was it? Margaret asked. Rebecca looked toward the church doors. A warning. The next morning proved her right. A certified letter arrived. From the county building department. Structural inspection notice. Potential code violations. Mandatory review. Deadline. 10 business days. Margaret read it twice. The timing was impossible to ignore. By afternoon, another envelope appeared. This one from an attorney representing Hawthorne Development Group. The language remained courteous throughout. Professional. Respectful. They expressed concern for public safety and community welfare. They also attached a preliminary purchase proposal for the church and surrounding interests. The offer was $750,000. To someone who had slept in her car a week earlier, it should have looked life-changing. Instead, it looked suspiciously small. Rebecca agreed. They're not offering what it's worth. They're offering what they think you'll accept before learning more. Margaret folded the letter and placed it beside her father's documents. That evening, another surprise arrived. Her son Daniel. He parked beside the church and stood awkwardly near the entrance holding a bakery box. The same man who had avoided her eyes while strangers emptied her house now suddenly wanted to talk. "Mom," he began carefully. "I've been hearing things." Margaret said nothing. Daniel glanced around the sanctuary. His expression changed when he saw the repaired windows, the cleaned pews, the stacks of organized documents. "This place." He hesitated. "It's actually pretty valuable, isn't it?" There it was. The word. Valuable. Not junk. Not burden. Valuable. Margaret remembered Emily calling it a dump. Daniel calling it dead weight. The estate attorney saying it had virtually no market value. Now the language had changed. Daniel sat down on a pew. "Look, maybe we all made mistakes. Maybe we should handle this together. As a family." Margaret studied him quietly. The house was family too. Daniel looked away. The silence stretched. Before leaving, he handed her an envelope. "You should read this." After he drove away, Margaret opened it. Inside sat a copy of one of the documents used during the transfer of her home. She had seen it before. Yet something caught her attention this time. A timestamp. Tiny. Nearly invisible. Near the notary seal. Margaret frowned. According to the document, she had supposedly signed paperwork at a time she was sitting in a hospital waiting room with dozens of witnesses while her friend underwent surgery. Her pulse quickened. She immediately photographed the page. Then she compared the signature against another document. The shapes matched. Too perfectly. As though copied rather than written. Rebecca arrived an hour later and studied the paperwork beneath the lantern light. "Margaret," she said quietly, "I think someone traced your signature." Outside, headlights appeared once more near the church entrance. The same black SUV. The same patient predator waiting in the dark. But this time Margaret carefully slid the original trust documents into a hidden compartment beneath the loose office panel, because Hawthorne still didn't know she had just found something far more dangerous than $12 million. Evidence that the first home taken from her may have been stolen. Margaret stepped into the Ashford County Courthouse with the envelope of original trust documents pressed tightly against her chest. The polished floors echoed under her worn shoes as she walked past the marble columns. Each step measured, deliberate. She found the clerk's office and requested a conference room usually reserved for property disputes. The door closed behind her, and the room smelled faintly of coffee, paper, and old linoleum. The air thick with the history of arguments settled and disputes lost. Across the table, Michael Hawthorne sat with his leather portfolio open, pen poised above a stack of papers, his smile polite but taut. "Mrs. Whitaker," he began, "you don't understand the procedural complexities. There are liens, easements, safety code issues. You, at your age, and with your limited resources, cannot manage this property." Margaret unwrapped the envelope slowly, setting the deeds, surveys, and ledger pages on the table. She pulled out the ledger page that had been torn in the office and placed it in front of him. The inked notations clearly contradicted the lien claim he referenced. She tapped the brass key with the stamped number 214 against the table. This key opens a locked drawer that contains documents showing full transfer of rights, she said, calm but unwavering. Hawthorne's pen froze midair. Margaret next revealed a photograph, old and frayed, of her father with Walter and several townspeople, smiling beside the church, ledger and deeds in hand. She held it up so everyone could see. These people can testify to the care and intentions behind this property, she added, glancing toward Walter, who had been called to the stand and now nodded subtly, confirming what Margaret said. Hawthorne's smile faltered. He tried again, citing clerical error, suggesting the county records had been misfiled. Margaret pulled out a bank letter showing escrow account deposits her father had made to secure the parcels. The county files and bank letters are consistent, she said. The signatures, the dates, the parcels, they're all verified. A hush fell across the room. Hawthorne's hands clenched the pen so tightly that the leather creased, his composed expression betraying a flicker of panic. Margaret placed the envelope's last sheet before him, a notarized copy of the deed linking every parcel directly to the trust, naming her as trustee. He leaned back, pale, realizing the leverage had shifted entirely. Margaret exhaled slowly, allowing the room to absorb the weight of decades carefully documented. Every claim of procedural obstruction, of her incapacity, of supposed danger to the property, crumbled against the layered evidence she had methodically laid out. For the first time, she was no longer defending a junked building. She was asserting control over a living legacy, her father's careful guardianship of a community that had been quietly protected. Hawthorne's gaze dropped to the documents again. He said nothing. The room remained silent except for the ticking of the wall clock and the distant hum of the courthouse ventilation. Margaret's eyes scanned the ledger, the deeds, the photograph, the brass key. Every piece aligned, undeniable. Justice, at least in paper and authority, had begun. Now the choice remained. What would she do with this inheritance her father had built, preserved, and hidden so meticulously, and how? Would she honor it? The choice remained. What would she do with this inheritance her father had built, preserved, and hidden so meticulously, and how would she honor it? The answer came more quietly than anyone expected. 3 months later, the black SUV no longer appeared outside St. Matthew Church. Hawthorne Development Group withdrew its challenges after county investigators began reviewing decades of land filings and trust records. The petition questioning Margaret's authority as trustee was dismissed. The forged signatures connected to the transfer of her home triggered a separate investigation. No dramatic courtroom confession followed. No handcuffs. No shouting. Just documents examined under bright lights and facts that refused to change. In the end, the deed to her family home was restored, and the sale was declared invalid. The house was legally hers again. Yet the first place Margaret returned was not the house. It was the church. On a cool September morning, sunlight streamed through newly restored stained glass windows and spilled across polished floorboards. Volunteers moved through the sanctuary carrying paint cans, lumber, and folding tables. Walter stood near the entrance arguing good-naturedly with a teenager about how to install a handrail correctly. The old church was alive again, not as a monument, as a place people actually used. The trust her father created was officially activated under her name. But instead of selling the land, Margaret followed the purpose hidden within the documents. A portion of the protected acreage became a community housing initiative for seniors who had lost homes or been pushed out by rising costs. Small cottages appeared along the edge of the property. Modest, safe, affordable. One by one, people moved in. A retired school bus driver, a widow living in her daughter's basement, a veteran sleeping in his truck. People who needed exactly what Margaret had once needed. Somewhere to belong. The old church office became a resource center. The fellowship hall hosted weekly meals. The ledger her father once used to quietly help struggling families now sat inside a glass display case near the entrance. Not as a secret anymore, as a reminder. Margaret often stopped beside it. The pages that once recorded unpaid bills and anonymous acts of kindness no longer felt like records of debt. They felt like proof. Proof that value could hide where nobody thought to look. Proof that dignity survived even when circumstances did not. One afternoon, several months after the court ruling, Daniel arrived at the church alone. He looked older than Margaret remembered. Smaller somehow. They sat together on the front steps beneath the bell tower. He apologized. Not perfectly, not eloquently, but honestly. Margaret listened. Forgiveness came slower than the apology, but it came. Some wounds healed through justice. Others healed through time. Before he left, Daniel helped her hang a wooden sign above the entrance. St. Matthew Community House. His hands trembled slightly while tightening the final bolt. Margaret noticed and said nothing. Some lessons were already doing their work. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Margaret remained alone inside the sanctuary. The last rays of sunlight filtered through the colored glass. She walked to the altar carrying 2 items. Her father's pocket watch and the brass key marked 214. For a long moment she simply stood there. Then she placed both objects inside a small display beside the ledger. The key was no longer a tool for opening hidden compartments. The deed was no longer just old paper. The trust was no longer a secret. Together they had become evidence of something larger. She had never been forgotten. She had never been worthless. Her father had not left her a fortune. He had left her a purpose. Outside, the church bell rang across the fields for the first time in years. Margaret stepped to the doorway and looked out at the cottages glowing beneath the evening sky, at porch lights turning on one by one, at people carrying groceries home, laughing, living. Then she rested her hand on the old wooden door and smiled as warm light spilled onto the front steps, because the place everyone once called junk had been waiting all along for someone wounded enough to need it, kind enough to protect it, and patient enough to uncover the legacy hidden inside.